Hi everybody, I'm Jack Gary. I'm the Director of Archaeology for Colonial Williamsburg, and I'm coming to you today, Facebook Live, here in the Archaeology Lab at Colonial Williamsburg. And while I was waiting for the stream to go live, I was taking a look at one of my favorite artifacts that was recovered from the Custis Square excavations. So I'll kind of show it to you here real quick. This is a spinning top. It's a child's toy, and perhaps you can see some of the bands that are going around it. You would have wrapped a string around this object, just like it's a top, and then you would have thrown it on the ground while pulling the string, and it would have spun around, and you would have played with your friends with their tops. And this came out of a well, recovered in 1964, and it's objects like these that really help us to connect with the people of the past. We can all imagine playing with a toy. We can imagine losing a toy. So it's nice to have objects like this to connect us to the past. So today we're talking about Custis Square, John Custis IV. So who is this guy? Why are we talking about him? Well, John Custis was one of the wealthiest guys in Virginia in the early 18th century. He was born in 1678, died in 1749, and you might know him from a couple of different distinctions. He was Martha Washington's first father-in-law. He was, like I said, one of the wealthiest guys in the colonies. He was a member of the Burgesses, Governor's Council, and he was a gardener extraordinaire. And he settled in Williamsburg around 1717, creating what was one of the most ornate gardens in the country at the time. And so we're using archaeology today to understand this site, to look at his life, to look at the enslaved people who worked there, and to try and help us understand what it looked like in his time. And so today I'll entertain some questions from you all about the site, about John Custis, about archaeology. And let me give you a couple more, kind of prime the pump here for you. Let me give you a couple more instances of John Custis and kind of let you know him from his own words. I like to introduce him usually with some of his own quotes, and he's a pretty quotable guy. So here's one of my favorites. He was kind of known as a grump. His brother-in-law was William Byrd II. William Byrd II was in England at the time. He was looking for his second wife. And John Custis wrote to Byrd, and he said, "Here have several ships arrived from London, but not one word from Colonel Byrd by any of them, which makes me think you were dead, or what is worse, married." So John Custis had a pretty contentious relationship with his own wife, a woman named Frances Park. They were married. They did not get along at all. They had quite the acrimonious relationship, and matter of fact, they disliked each other so much that they had to have a lawyer draw up articles of agreement to settle their differences. And in the articles it said that John should provide Frances with enough money to clothe herself and the children. In return, Frances had to stop calling John Custis bad names in public. So that was the deal that they had to work out. Here's one more. John Custis was particularly close with money, and if you'll indulge me, one more quote here. Custis was sick for almost a whole year. He thought he was going to die. He recovered. He owed his recovery to drinking chocolate every day. So he wanted to get more chocolate from one of his merchants, but he didn't want to have to pay a lot of money for it. He wanted chocolate that was good and cheap. Of course, we know about chocolate. There's no such thing as good and cheap chocolate. But he said he had a solution to this. He said, "It's reasonable to think that some prizes may be taken from the Spaniard who's hauling cocoa, which will make it cheap." John Custis was advocating for piracy to get himself some cheap hot chocolate. So anyhow, just a couple of instances of the guy. He's an interesting character. He's been fun for us to look into, and the archaeology is starting to help us expand our knowledge of him. We have been working at the site of Custis Square, and for those of you who are familiar with Williamsburg, it's on the south side of town. It is at the intersection of Francis and Nassau Street, just across the street from the public hospital and today the art museums of Colonial Williamsburg. It's an open pasture. In 1964, archaeologists here at Colonial Williamsburg did the first excavations to look at that site, and they uncovered the foundations of Custis's house. They found the well, they found the kitchen, and one other outbuilding. But they never really fully understood the garden landscape when they did those excavations. Now, a lot of the artifacts that are on the bench in front of me came from those excavations, and a lot of them came from the well, which had been filled in over time, starting in the early 18th century, and was eventually filled in completely in the late 18th century, and recovered just an enormous amount of artifacts over those different time periods. So we can use some of those to answer some of your questions today, hopefully. So what are we working on today before we get into your questions? We've gone back to this site. We're looking at a couple of main research questions. One, as I mentioned, what did it look like? What did the garden landscape look like? Two, What were the lives of enslaved people like on this property? John Custis owned over 200 enslaved individuals. Most of them lived on his outlying plantations, but many of them, well, some of them were working at Custis Square, his gardeners, his cooks, his personal servants. What were their lives? How do we see them in the archaeological record at Custis Square? And then how has this site changed over time? Who were the first people that lived there? Who were the last people that lived there? The idea is to be able to give our guests a full picture of what life was like in the early, well, no, really across the time periods at Custis Square. So, with that quick little introduction, I am happy to take any questions, and I'm going to turn to Crystal Castleberry, who is our public archaeologist, and she's going to feed some questions. Hopefully you've got some.
I do. Denise asks, how long do you think it'll take to finish the work at Custis Square?
Great, thanks for the question, Denise. Yeah, how long will it take for us to finish the work at Custis Square? Thankfully, we have funding to do a 5-year project, 5 years of excavation. We've already completed our first year, so we've got 4 more years, and one of our end goals for this project is to, as I said, to get a fulsome interpretation, but there may be elements of that garden landscape that we can find through the archaeology that we can restore, and restore it very accurately based on what we're finding. So another 4 years. The site is open to the public when we're open, and we can't wait to welcome everyone back once we're open again, to drop in and see what we're working on.
Another question for you. Madeline asks, at what age you started studying archaeology?
Cool question. Thanks, Madeline. That's a great question. Okay, what age did I start studying archaeology? As a little kid, I really was fascinated with archaeology, and it starts, like a lot of kids, fascination with mummies, ancient Egypt, burying things in my backyard and then digging them up. And I have to credit my parents, actually, for allowing me to get involved with the Archaeological Society of Virginia early on as a young teen, and I studied with a couple people. And then I came to William & Mary as an undergraduate, and that's when I really started getting into archaeology. After that, I went to Boston for graduate school, and here I am back in Virginia.
Bethany asks, how many kids did the Custis family have, and are they buried here in Williamsburg?
Oh, okay. Thanks, Bethany. How many kids did the Custis family have? So John and Frances, his wife, had 2 children, a son and a daughter. The daughter, Fanny, is how she was referred to, died in her early 20s, I believe. His son is Daniel Park Custis, who is the first husband of the woman who would become Martha Washington. Daniel Park Custis was living at the New Kent plantation called White House, so kind of outside of Richmond. And he died in 1757, and he is buried here in Williamsburg, I believe. I'll have to check on that one. I'll have to check on both where Fanny and Daniel are buried. But 2 children. But there's another child. I 2 children with Frances. John also had a child. He never was explicit about it, but we feel pretty certain that John also had a child with an enslaved woman named Alice. That child's name was John. He was referred to as Jack. And John Custis absolutely loved this boy. He freed him. He gave him his freedom when he was 9 years old. And in Custis's will, he provided a 200-acre plantation for Jack, along with money to set him up, horses, furniture, and a house. Sadly, Jack never lived to be old enough to realize any of that. He died as a young teen, a couple years after John Custis himself died. So really the answer to the question, Bethany, is he had 3 children.
Gray asks, so many things were found in the well. How big was it?
Oh, okay. The well, all right, let me show you a picture. Okay, let's see if we can get this up there on the screen. This is a picture taken in 1964 when they excavated the well, looking down the well shaft while excavating it. So the diameter of the well it's a couple feet in diameter, about 4 or 5 feet in diameter. It was 40 feet deep. Now, what's kind of cool about this, actually there's a lot of cool things about the well. John Custis, in 1737, he refers to digging a well, and he mentions that at 40 feet is when they stopped. And they stopped at 40 feet, and he said that they started to find petrified cockles. what he's referring to is he was finding fossilized shells that are part of a geological formation that underlines Williamsburg called the Yorktown Formation. It's full of literally millions of years old shells and fish bones, and he started pulling some of those up out of the well, and he was fascinated by this, and he was so interested that he sent them to his friend Peter Collinson over in England as a curiosity. So he shared his finding from the bottom of the well.
Rachel would like to know what kind of technologies you're using to study the plants in the garden.
Oh, okay. What technologies are we using to study plants in the garden? We have three. We have three primary analytical techniques that we use. One is what's called pollen analysis, palynological analysis. Believe it or not, pollen that is floating around in the air, boy, don't we know about that right now here springtime in Williamsburg. It's just been insane. Pollen can last in the ground for hundreds of years under the right conditions. And so what we do is we take samples of soil from certain layers that we're excavating, and we send them off to an analyst, and they can extract those preserved pollen grains. And by looking at the shapes of the pollen grains, they can identify what plants were around. Now, of course, we know pollen, it's floating all over the place. So the plants that we see from that analysis are plants that, it's very regional in what we're seeing. There's another type of analysis called phytolith analysis. These are microscopic plant silicas that get dropped in the soil. They're inside of blades of grass, they're inside leaves. And they don't fall very far, they don't travel very far from where they land. Again, a microscopic thing. By extracting them, we can see what types of plants are growing in the very near area. Another technique is chemical analysis. And it doesn't necessarily show us what plants are growing there, but it can tell us what's going on in certain areas. And if we see a dark stain in the ground, and we look at the chemical analysis, or the chemical composition of that dark stain, it might have elements in it that indicate it's been fertilized, that manure has been added into it, or ash has been added into it to fertilize it for a planting hole. So we use all of these techniques, we bring them together to really get a pretty clear picture of what landscapes look like in the past. So it's really specific and really fine-grained types of analysis. Good question. We're going to do a lot of that with this site.
Anne-Marie has a couple of questions for you about the medicinal interests of Custis. She wants to know whether or not Custis had any interest in the medicinal use of plants and herbs, and whether or not any of the enslaved men or women were practicing medicine on the Custis property.
Fantastic. They're all fantastic questions. What am I saying? This is a great one. John Custis was really interested in medicine and developing medicinal remedies. He kept a commonplace book in which he recorded, I think, over 180 medicinal remedies that cured everything from sore throats to sprained ankles to more serious injuries. And he was using that medicine to treat himself. He always felt very sickly most of his life. He used it to treat his enslaved people. And he also used it to treat the indigent in Williamsburg. If you didn't have enough money to go to a real doctor, you could come to John Custis and he would provide medicine for you. And let me show you an artifact. While we're talking about this, let's see if we can see this, see if this shows up. This is a pharmaceutical vial that was found in the well. So it's these types of glass bottles in which Custis would have been keeping some of these medicinal remedies. Now, were enslaved people involved with this? I can't think off the top of my head right now if there are any direct references to enslaved people and their knowledge of plants being incorporated. Nope, I take that back. I do know of one. John Custis wrote in his commonplace book that there was a man named Dr. Paw Paw or Dr. Pan Pan, and he was copying a medicine of Dr. Paw Paw or Dr. Pan Pan. This man was a formerly enslaved person whose remedy he was recording. So yes, he was getting some information from enslaved people. His own enslaved people, I'm not sure about that, but certainly their knowledge of plants would have fed into his interest in medicine. And if you'll indulge me, one more quote from Custis, because it's great. I want to read one of his. I had it at the ready. I want to read one of his remedies, just to kind of give you a sense of what these things were like. This is a remedy for a sore throat. He wrote down, he said, take a pint of sharp vinegar, 1 handful of sage, some blackberry and briar roots. Also put in with them the bark of white mulberry root, a spoonful of honey, and a spoonful of sugar, and boil them all together. So a botanical or an herbal tea, we'd almost recognize that today. He goes on to write, he says, new horse dung fried in vinegar and applied on the outside of the throat will also work just as well. So you had your choice of remedies there. I think I chose the first one. Okay.
We've had a couple of questions come in about restoring the garden and the house. Is there any possibility of those things happening?
Good question. Okay, restoring the garden and the house. The house is a tricky one. The excavations of the house, and if you'll permit me another picture here, and this might be a little hard to see. When the foundation of the house was found, and actually, foundation is a misnomer here. What we found, it's just a hole in the ground where the cellar was, and it turns out that the foundation of the house was robbed of brick completely, and so there's very little evidence of what the foundations were like, and we don't really know what it looked like. So it's going to be difficult for us to do a very accurate restoration of the house. The garden is another story. As we talked about some of the techniques that we can use to look at gardens and to understand plants that were growing there, I think we have a really good chance of being able to know with some degree of specificity what this garden landscape looked like. And yes, I would hope that we can put together a plan so sometime in the future we could actually restore elements of that garden and bring our visitors in and let them enjoy it.
Switching gears back to you a little bit, William would like to know how many big projects you've worked on.
Oh, how many big projects have I worked on? Well, this is, William, thanks. This is the biggest project I think I've ever worked on. It's a 5-year-long project. Prior to coming to Williamsburg, I also worked on a very large project in Bedford County, Virginia, at a place called Thomas Jefferson's Poplar Forest. It was Thomas Jefferson's second home and retreat, and I led the archaeology there for 12 years. A lot of different types of projects at that property. And then I led another big project, helped lead a big project up in Massachusetts when I was in graduate school. But I got to tell you, leading the Custis project this is a pretty special one.
What do you think the most fascinating object you've found at Custis Square is? This is coming from Doug. And the most mundane.
The most mundane, I like it. Well, Doug, a lot of what archaeologists find, it's a great question, a lot of what we find is mundane stuff. It's the stuff of everyday life. It's things that people are throwing out. Let's see, a lot of this stuff here in front of me, it's here because it was trash and it filled somebody's house. Here's a nice, I think this is kind of a mundane object that has a neat story to it. It's a small tin cup. And it's also called a gill cup or a gill cup, and it's 4 ounces, and these would have been used to ration out liquids, primarily liquor, rum, other spirits would have been rationed out. So that would be your daily ration of alcohol right there. So 4 ounces is your ration. All right, now, what's one of the neatest artifacts, or I'll show you one of my favorite artifacts. Let me put on a glove because it's iron, and I don't want the oils in my skin to corrode the metal. Okay, this one, and we've done some video on this on our Facebook page. You may have seen it, and it's still my favorite artifact from Custis Square. This is a flute or a fife, but as I love to point out, it didn't start out life as a flute or a fife. This is actually a pistol barrel. It's the barrel of a fowling pistol that would have been common in the late 1600s, early 1700s. It was found in the well at Custis Square. It broke, as you can see right here, and whether it broke when it was a pistol, possibly exploding and rendering it useless, and they decided, well, let's turn it into a flute, or whether it broke after it was a flute is unclear. But it's like the top that I started out with. It's an object like this. You can see an individual. I mean, there's a person that is drilling these holes. For what reason? Probably because they're bored. They're looking for something to do. They're repurposing an old thing. All things that we can relate to today. So I really like this one. So this is that's the full length of the barrel. So the rest of the wooden part of the pistol would have been right through here in the handle coming down like that. So I guess one of my favorite artifacts from the site.
We have a couple of questions coming in about the enslaved population. Can you talk about some of the evidence that they left behind?
Sure. Well, in the landscape itself, when you're out at the site and you look at the landscape, you can certainly see their labor in the landscape. It's been reshaped. When we find planting holes, these stains in the ground where plants were growing, that's the evidence of an enslaved person's work. Now, other pieces of evidence, artifact-wise, that we can talk about the presence of enslaved people. This object here is a good one. This is a type of ceramic that archaeologists call Colonial ware. It is a low-fired, locally made ceramic, and it's most likely being made by local enslaved people, local Native Americans, probably a blend of their potting traditions. And so this would have been inexpensive wares that enslaved people would have been making. They would have been using themselves, but they also would have been selling it around town. This one in particular is a chamber pot. And you can see it's very well made, to the point of even having, maybe you can see it, these little artistic details on it. So we get to see the skill of the potter in an object like this. We also have to think that not only was probably an enslaved person making this somewhere in the Williamsburg area, there's certainly an enslaved person who was handling this object. This was found in a drain at Custis Square, and that drain was most likely carrying water out of the basement, but we think it could have also been carrying waste away too, and this was dropped down in that drain. So it reminds us of their presence on the landscape. And then one other object that I'll point out is this. Again, talking about shaping the landscape, this is a garden spade. Pretty common for the time period, also found in the well. And we have to ask ourselves, who's at the other end of the handle of this object? This would have been the tool of most likely a very skilled enslaved person, a skilled gardener. And we know a couple of names of enslaved folks who were living and working at Custis Square. A man named Anthony is listed as being a gardener in the Custis that Custis owned. And there are a couple other folks too that are named. And we want to bring their stories to life out there at Custis Square too.
Olivia would like to know why the property was covered back up after it was dug in the 1960s.
Oh, okay. Yeah, when we excavate sites, as you've probably seen, we excavate in squares very carefully, and we find things, we document them, and then most of the time we cover them back up. The reason we do this is to preserve the site. We don't excavate every square inch of a site, and so the edges of the areas that we have excavated, if we leave them open, they can start to crumble in and actually destroy archaeological evidence in other parts of the site. So we fill them back in and we preserve them for the future. And that was we're really thankful for the archaeologists who came before us. They decided at the time in 1964 that, we've learned a lot, but we don't have all the technologies we need to be able to fully understand this site, and particularly to understand the garden. So they decided to stop, fill it in, and wait for the future when that technology was available. Thankfully, we're here now, the technology is available, and we're coming back. But even we won't excavate the entire site. We'll fill it back in when we're done. Hopefully we'll then be able to restore some of it after filling it in too.
Tracy would like to know why things were thrown in the well.
Yeah, that's a great question. We ask the question ourselves too, because wells are pretty valuable. They're your drinking water, or your water for doing everything really. And so why was stuff thrown in the well? Well, let's use the play on words there. They're great places to get rid of trash. So when the well was excavated at Custis Square, what we found is that the bottom layers had actually mostly, it had almost 60 wine bottles down in the bottom. A lot of other artifacts too. A lot of it dating to the 1730s, 1740s, the time period when John Custis was there. Okay, it all looks like everything was dumped in there very quickly at one time, as if someone was cleaning out the house. What we think happened is in 1758, when Martha Washington, she's now Martha Washington, took over the ownership of the property, she auctioned off a lot of the stuff in the house, and it seems that everything she couldn't sell and didn't want to keep herself, she dumped down into the well. But it wasn't enough to fill the well, it just kind of settled to the bottom, and there was still plenty of water, and it kept being used for several decades after that. Then, we're not sure why, but the owners in the late 1700s decided that the well was no longer good. They didn't want to use it anymore, and they just started filling it in with all the trash that they had lying around. So it's just a great repository to get rid of stuff, get it out of the way.
Amy would like to know what was happening at Custis Square before and after John Custis lived there.
Yeah, thanks, Amy. Before John Custis, actually we've got really great evidence that's just starting to come up in our recent excavations. I've got a couple of artifacts here. We're finding quite a few what archaeologists call projectile points, what most folks know as arrowheads. We call them projectile points because most often they're not actually at the ends of arrows. They were at the ends of spears or darts. So we're starting to find a layer of soil. I hope you can see that. Here's one of them. This is a projectile point that dates to about 5,000, 4,500 BC, believe it or not. So we have evidence of Native Americans on this site long before John Custis was there. After Custis, the property was inherited by his son, Daniel Park Custis, and then it was rented out for quite a while to a variety of different people. Martha and George Washington owned it. They started to rent it. It was eventually bought by a man named James McClurg. Other people lived there. And then by 1830, the house had fallen into disrepair, and the house was demolished. And soon after that, the public hospital, or Eastern State Hospital, bought the property, and they turned it into a park for the patients at the hospital.
Jack would like to know whether or not any of the items will be placed out for public display.
Thanks, Jack. Yes, they will. There'll be a couple of different ways that you can see the artifacts from the Custis Square excavations. I'm really excited to announce that in the expanded art museum, there will be a gallery specifically dedicated to archaeology. And fingers crossed we'll have an exhibit up in 2021. But that'll be a place where these objects can be displayed. We also have pop-up exhibits around town as well where you can see them. If you take a tour of the laboratory when we open back up, on Tuesdays, some of the stuff will be out and you can see it there. And let's see, where else? Online. Check it out online, too. We'll be posting stuff there as well.
And Anita would like to know whether or not Custis would have known about Swedish botanist Karl von Linn.
Oh, I don't know. would Custis have known about Karl von Linn? I'm not sure. We will look into it. We'll make a note and we'll take a look at that after this. Yeah, good question.
So James would like to know why Custis Square is called a square.
Oh, yeah, and it's technically not a square. It's actually kind of a rectangle. It's 4 acres in size. It was called Custis Square as early as 1715. This was before Custis's house was even built. Custis purchased the property around 1714, and the first real reference to it in 1715 calls it Custis Square. And I think it's just denoting that it's a large space. So it's 4 acres. The lots that were being sold off in Williamsburg at that time in the early 18th century were half-acre lots. What Custis did is he combined 8 half-acre lots into 4 acres. So he created this big piece of property. Most pieces of property were not that big in Williamsburg. So I think it was really to denote how large the site was.
This will be the last question. Kathy would like to know how it was that Custis got so wealthy.
Custis's wealth came through a couple of different channels, tobacco being the primary one. Custis did not come from humble beginnings. He was born into an already pretty wealthy family on the eastern shore of Virginia, and as a young man, as a teenager, he was sent to England, sent to London to be apprenticed with tobacco merchants. And he learned really the art of making money there in London. And when he came back to Virginia, he inherited his grandfather's tobacco plantation. So he started raising the tobacco. He knew how to work the merchants on the other side, and he started making a lot of money that way. His marriage to Frances Park, very advantageous. He got a lot of money that way. When his father-in-law died, money came in that way. And we have to remind ourselves that all of the labor on these plantations, a lot of this money is coming through the labor of enslaved people. So that's what's providing him the means to purchase the things that we see here today. So that's the primary ways that he got so wealthy. Well, that indication was the last question. So I had a lot of fun. This was a blast. So I'm excited to welcome people back to Colonial Williamsburg when we open back up. Custis Square, the site out there, when we open back up, you'll be able to take tours of it. So you can go out and see the excavations in progress. And I'm thrilled to be able to welcome people back when we're able to do that. So I want to thank Crystal for moderating and asking the questions. I want to thank you guys for asking the questions. And I look forward to following up with everybody. So take care, everyone, and we will see you soon, I hope.